Your Majesties, High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet, Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my very great honour and pleasure to welcome you here. My name is Dan Smith. I'm Director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and this is the second SIPRI Annual Lecture. Last year's given by Hans Blix, and I'm so pleased to see you here, Hans, and this year by Michelle Bachelet. I want to thank you, Staffan Scheja, for that beautiful rendition of Chopin's Nocturne. Staffan will be back to, he's played us in and he will play us out at the end with a piece by Wilhelm Stenhammar, the Fantasy in B minor. Now, we're here to listen to Michelle Bachelet, and then there will be a brief conversation between the speaker, myself, and my boss, Jan Eliasson, the chair of the Board of Governors of SIPRI. Michelle, as you know, Michelle Bachelet is former president of Chile. She was the president of Chile in 2006 to 2010, and again 2014 to 2018. She's the first woman to be a president of Chile. She's the first president of Chile to be elected to a second term since 1932. She's now the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Michelle Bachelet's father was arrested during the Pinochet coup in 1973, held in prison and tortured and died in prison. Michelle and her mother were arrested the following year. Michelle was held for a month and then exiled. She returned to Chile in 1979. She graduated in medical studies as a physician-surgeon in 1983. She became the Minister for Health in 2000 to 2002. She was Minister of Defense in 2002 to 2004. And she was then, I think, persuaded, invited, pleaded with to run for the presidency. And after the presidency, she was also head of UN Women, and then she returned to the country, and a second presidency followed. I just noted when I was looking into your background, High Commissioner, that you won in 2005 election with 53.5% of the vote, and that you won in 2013 with 62% of the vote. So this suggests you must have been doing something right in your first term. Michelle Bachelet is going to speak to us on a theme which I think you can see from my very, very brief outline of her life. She is extraordinarily, perhaps almost maybe uniquely qualified to talk about peace, development, human rights, and gender equality, the story of her life. Michelle Bachelet, please, you're welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Dan. Your Majesties, Minister Margot Wallström, members of the board, excellencies, friends, colleagues. It is an honor to speak at this institute, in this ceremony here, who's an institute whose work on the themes of peace, accountability, and prevention, including the facilitation of dialogue and analysis of the security risk generated by climate change, I have known for a long time. Due to my interest in climate change, I was recently reminded of the idea of a keystone species. As you may know, a keystone species is a plant or animal which functions in its ecosystem like the keystone in an arc. It keeps other forces in balance. This species may look humble, like a starfish, but if it's removed, the ecosystem will collapse. Why am I saying this? Because I decided to take up this job as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I'm here today partly due to one or two keystones which have brought me the passion to try to do what should be done and the conviction to speak out in favor of the ideas I believe in. So dialogue has been one of my keystones. I have found it's fundamental to issues such as reconciliation, which, as you know, it's a painstaking and difficult process for many countries, including my own. What's important is to expand our understanding and establish spaces of dialogue which may become bridges between opposing points of view and help create a road to durably peaceful societies. Where there is a confrontational spirit, positive progress is less likely. During my tenure as Minister of Defense, I had to address the issue of amnesty for human rights violations perpetrated by the military, but at the same time bringing some level of peace to the relatives of the disappeared. So we need to move forward towards truth, justice, and reconciliation. So through dialogue with some key military leaders, we set up and strengthen processes and strategies which allow us to say to each other, look, we might never agree on what happened in the past, but we all love our nation. We need to ensure that it is stable and its democracy is not endangered. Another keystone has been conviction. It might seem very unlikely, but I have learned that within that dialogue, if one maintains a clear and determined grasp on principle, advances in a constructive way, and sets clear priorities, then one can achieve important progress. In my career, I have kept always this in mind, be it as Minister of Health, when the first priority was to improve not only primary care, but also the whole health system, and addresses inequalities in access and quality of care. So the same was true when I became President of Chile. It was an occasion of tremendous joy and an explosion of possibilities. The biggest task we faced was making Chilean society more inclusive. Of course, building on what my predecessors have done, but taking also the new challenges, trying to undo discrimination, which held so many people back, forcing them to the margins of society. And to build a more cohesive society, we need to focus much more on spreading out economic growth and making sure that that economic growth will benefit a much wider group of people with better services and strong focus also on early child development. And in my second presidential term, we made it possible for all students, women and men, in Chile to obtain not only primary and secondary, but also university education free of charge for the majority of the students. So we move fast on other key reforms, including reforms to ensure more representation of women in political parties and in parliament. We work to provide wider public childcare so that mothers could work. We strengthened laws against domestic violence. We built a stronger economic base. So we did a lot of things that I felt were fundamental in a society that gradually could ensure and expand democracy and people's rights. I'm a pediatrician, and when you're a pediatrician, you know that the big picture may be very important, but you also know that the big picture is always made up of little pictures, individual life. And any economic theory or political theory, for that matter, which does not focus on human beings, is just that, a theory. Economic and political systems exist in order to improve people's well-being. And what we try to do is that our policies were people-centered, so the policy would adapt to people's reality, not people have to adapt to the policies that were made in a room in a ministry. So we have to do all we can to ensure that all, and especially the younger generation, do not need to wait to gain access to the basic elements of human dignity. And I mentioned this because as High Commissioner, I want to bring in this new position, on one hand, these keystones like dialogue and convictions that are key elements for complying with my mandate, because I must ensure that human rights are at the core of the whole UN work. But also I want to bring to my position my experience, because being young, having been in prison, having working on NGO during dictatorship, but afterwards being in office in many different positions. So that gives me, I think, a wide perspective of, on one hand, what the human rights problems are, but on the other hand, what are the kinds of situations that sometimes leaders had to confront when they make decisions. And I believe in this work on human rights, we all can contribute. The work of my office in promoting and protecting human rights around the world is unique. But how could anyone think that one office would be the only voice in the world of every society? And it is one we can achieve. And of course, Sweden has been an excellent ally in their commitment with human rights-based policies nationally and internationally. We all know that justice matters. Justice can bring peace. It doesn't eliminate disputes. But when people have confidence in an impartial and independent structure of law and norms, they know that they will be able to resolve the differences peacefully. So this is true within and among countries, as long as the international rule of law retains the confidence of relevant actors. Because shared solutions work. Whether we're talking about shared laws or an agreement on joint action to target a common problem based on shared principles, policies that are grounded in dialogue, built on inclusion, and guided by human rights goals, make for more effective and better outcomes. They have worked in the past to encourage peace and development, and they can work in the future, shared with billions of other people across the world. Policies that build social justice and social protection also promote stronger economies. They drive better frameworks for education, healthcare, and other basic services. And they feed into political systems, which actively embrace a range of noisy contributing voices. Human rights-based policies build confidence and social harmony. They deepen trust. They build hope. In our lifetime, this has happened again and again in various parts of the world, as policies grounded in human rights shape greater justice, equality, and dignity. And it can be done again. So we are facing very strong challenges. Yet with conviction and through dialogue, we can address them and achieve peace and security. And while we continue to work with the traditional human rights challenges, like political and civil rights, we're also addressing third-generation issues. Climate change. Climate change is a comprehensive and devastating threat to human rights, and indeed human life. The increasingly relentless reality of climate change requires that we work together as never before. So we need to generate growth that is socially legitimate, environmentally sustainable, and broadly inclusive. To achieve this, we must change our development models. It might seem impossible, but this kind of structural reform can be carried out, and I have seen it done. From increased poverty and food insecurity to growing water stress and accelerated environmental damage, it is a clear threat to human dignity and to the gains that have been made in building up inclusive and sustainable development. Climate change is driving displacement and heightening tensions and inequalities within societies, driving conflict, including violent conflict. For example, in terms of the importance of some of these issues in some very well-known situations, like the so-called caravan, the migrant flows that have increased in some Central American countries, which are experiencing longer and more frequent droughts, which impact the livelihood of numerous people. But at the same time, we see, unfortunately, not so positive outcomes in issues we thought we have improved. And let me mention about food insecurity. After many years in which undernourishment and food insecurity has declined, the number of undernourished people rose from 777 million in 2015 to 815 million in 2016, and mainly due to conflicts, as well as drought and other climate-linked disasters. 815 million people is 11% of humanity. In other words, 1 out of every 9 women, men, and children around the world is still going without sufficient food. But what about economic inequalities? They're also growing. There is more wealth, yes, but more inequality. As ILO, the International Labour Organization, has pointed out, the labor share of GDP has been falling for 25 years, and this trend has continued. Oxfam has asserted that 82% of all the wealth generated in 2016 went to the richest 1% of the global population, while the poorest half of humanity saw no change in their income, leaving them then further behind. The UN's 2019 Financing for Sustainable Development report says that low wage growth, rising inequalities, and insufficient action on the Sustainable Development Goals threaten to undermine the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Yet another challenge is the shrinking civil society space, which has repercussions across a very wide spectrum of government policies and human rights. Participation by the people in decision-making is a vital force to drive accountability. When governments shut down all criticism, they are no longer listening to the contributions of all the people. So the results are a negative impact on housing, education, and health policies, as well as development, defense, and every sector of state activity. Measures that curtail the rights and voices of civil society also undermine our hope of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. In a wide number of countries, laws and policies that restrict and in many cases criminalize civic activity are increasingly being adopted. These measures include restriction on freedom of expression and participation in peaceful demonstrations, restriction on free and independent media sources, restriction on the ability to register human rights NGOs to receive foreign funding, and vaguely worded anti-terrorism legislation, which can be misused to target almost any form of criticism. And one of the new areas that we're also working very strongly is technology and human rights. Because we are talking about digital space and human rights. We're talking about artificial intelligence. We're saying that they can be a fantastic instrument in expanding democracy, in expanding knowledge, and ensuring people's rights. But the truth is that all of that is completely true, but on the other hand, it can be used and misused, as we have also seen. It can be used to propagate hate speech. And as a matter of fact, in Myanmar, through social media, the hate speech against the Rohingyas was a very important thing that triggered a lot of violence. We have seen in some other parts of the world as well. We have seen that thanks to this kind of technology, human rights defenders or journalists have been harassed, arrested, or even killed because they have been tracked in this way. And we have also seen that artificial intelligence is not perfect, and we have to be well aware of their threats. For example, we have seen and I've been working with the tech companies because there has been finding that artificial intelligence is developed by people, and people have bias. And when you go to the Silicon Valley, you see that the majority of the developers are white male. So what they have seen is that many of the algorithms and the platforms developed are gender biased, and they're also biased on Afro descent. So things that can be powerful instrument to really expand people's rights can be also have a very complicated issue. So we're working with the tech companies, with universities, inviting private sector, public sector, to try to deal with these new challenges. That means a lot of opportunity, but all a possible violation of human rights, and to discuss among all these stakeholders which are the best solutions. Because today what is happening is that every country by its own is making its own solution, and we need to think globally on something. So how, as I heard, one of the very important scientist, chief scientist of one of these very big tech companies, to do tech for good. Another area where we all have a responsibility to remain alert is women's rights. Advances made in previous decades have stalled in some places, and in some cases are heading backwards. Though these rollbacks are underpinned by what seems to be a renewed obsession with controlling and limiting women's decision over their bodies and lives, and by views that a woman's role should be essentially restricted to reproduction and family. Women are still much poorer than men. They have less property, fewer opportunities, less access to basic services, and a lot less freedom to raise their voices and make their own choices. That doesn't mean that we have seen at the same time the Me Too movement, and we have seen in Latin America, Ni Una Menos. This is a movement against violence against women. So we see that women's groups are organizing and trying to make their voices be heard, but there's a lot of pushbacks and makes things very difficult. We also see that LGBTIQ communities and their rights are still being harassed or criminalized in many parts of the world. So what I could say is that in the heart of many conflicts, we can find inequalities. Inequality of rights, inequality of access, inequality of opportunities. And we need to deal with the root causes if we want to prevent conflicts from happening. Because the devastation of today's conflict and the huge economic and humanitarian costs create broad and enduring harm. There is no victory, no winner in a conflict that destroys lives, land, infrastructure, economies, and hope. We are seeing fewer wars between states, but more and more enduring interstate conflicts with the involvement many times of foreign countries. Greater efforts must be made to rationalize and control the proliferation of arms and the conduct and risk of conflict. But instead, countries are eroding the agreements which do exist. It has been 70 years, not only since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also since the Geneva Conventions, when they laid out the minimal, basic decencies to be respected by all parties in conflict, to preserve the lives and dignity of civilians, or the combat soldiers and prisoners of war. But we see in Yemen that people will send missiles to hospitals and to schools in other places of the world as well. So, but the actors of today's conflict increasingly fail to respect even these minimal commitments. Unfortunately, and we used to see, and Minister Wallström was very engaged with that, how women were used as weapons of war, and women, and there was gender-based violence in many places, and rape used as weapon of war. But unfortunately, in places where there used to be war, and now there is none, but gender-based violence remains as a huge threat for many women. What to say about children? Children are tortured and killed in front of their parents. To create widespread fear, they are abducted and used as soldiers, or as sexual slaves. They are deprived of education. And although measures to identify these violations and hold those responsible to account are being taken, including my office, of course, is playing an important role on that behalf, they are not unanimously supported by the world states. So governments need to do a much better job to support accountability for violations of international humanitarian law. Conflicts impoverish nations and drive displacement. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 44,400 people are forced to flee their homes every day because of conflict or persecution. Most are internally displaced. Others will try desperately to find safety across international borders. And these migrants are women, men, and children exactly like you and me. They are our equals, but increasingly, instead of measures to assist and protect them, they are greeted by barriers, pushed back into danger, and humiliated, threatened, detained, and exposed to unnecessary risk. A great deal more could be said about these three challenges, all of them connected. Climate change, fueling migration and conflict. Conflict too, fueling migration. But there are a number of other very significant challenges to human rights that are also increasing in scope and intensity today. There is a global rise in hatred being directed at members of racial, ethnic, and religious groups, as well as against foreigners and other minorities. In many countries, what used to be extremist ideas are now enter the political mainstream, in tandem with a nativist, exclusionary, and intolerant worldview that also attacks efforts to maintain multilateral agreements and measures to ensure greater social justice. And this worldview exacerbates global instability by shirking instead of sharing global burdens. So all these negative trends, profoundly corrosive to our hope for a distant future, seem to accelerate and accentuate each other. But the solutions are also connected. Some countries, not always the richest in income or resources, are choosing to adopt principled policies that are also more effective because they are grounded in the full range of human rights, taking steps to advance civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights together. They are more effective. I'm fully aware of the constraints of leaders, often very heavy historic, political, economic, and even cultural constraints. But I also know that the most effective solutions are grounded in constructive dialogue, a focus on human beings, and principled determination. Military leaders can commit to ending military interventions in democratic politics. Centuries of prejudice and discrimination can be ended. Even in a very conservative societies, consensus can be achieved to begin dismantling that legacy. So optimism can be realistic. Well, I said, to be honest, after all this not very sunny image, but at least I say that I'm strategically optimistic. Maybe tactically not that much, but strategically yes, because I think a human rights agenda is a practical plan of action. and it is possible to change course. Countries can reverse their positions and embark on principled, unifying transformation. Because I'm so convinced there will be no lasting well-being when only a few privileged groups benefit from economic growth. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development calls on all countries to transform together, based on their own strength, and to expand their inclusive forces to meet our shared challenges. So the world is a better place when we work together, men and women, people from all sides of the political spectrum, though sometimes it's not very easy, and all countries around the world. So all of us, not only government but also individuals, must dare to embark on that dialogue and that engagement. So we can create a mutually reinforcing dynamic in which justice and greater civic freedom build sound development policies, and measures for social protection feed into a greater social harmony and trust. We need to reform institutions, which has questionable legitimacy because of corruption or other factors, which mean they fail to respond to the needs of the people. Trust is essential to ensuring the unity and harmony of any society. So we're currently witnessing a rejection and a lack of confidence in governments. But clearly, only in a space of respect and trust will collective projects be able to evolve, linking individual expectation and initiative with the great dreams of a society. So this kind of institutional reconciliation and reform is difficult, but it is possible, and I have seen it done. In the face of growing opposition, we need to reinforce multilateralism. We need to strengthen our capacity for dialogue, both regionally and globally, in order to reach realistic agreements. We need principled leadership to ensure a global, fair, and sustainable model of development, which quells people's anxieties about survival, hunger, poverty, and violence. And I firmly believe we can do this. But by trying to see matters with full clarity and understand other points of view, by acting with integrity to advance justice and human rights, by seeking always to build on your love for other people and all forms of life, by looking to construct and advance rather than destroy, we can turn the tide. We can build more durable peace, more sustainable development, and greater justice, dignity, and rights. So we have a path to solve the problems of climate change and growing conflict. We have the 2030 Agenda, which has been fully negotiated by every state and can eradicate extreme poverty and include far more people in the benefits of development. We have the Paris Agreement, which calls for focused action to mitigate and slow environmental disaster, and its implementation has the potential for real impact. And all of these measures rely on support for human dignity, equality, and human rights. Fundamental rights and freedoms are the elements that build resilient societies, which are able to withstand and surmount threats, peacefully resolve disputes, and facilitate sustained progress in prosperity and well-being for all their members. And you know this is true, because it has been true in your own lives. Those of you who have benefited from life in peaceful and sustainably prosperous societies are living in countries where people's rights are being upheld. Those of you who have not always benefited from such conditions in your own life will know what I'm talking about. Actions that are grounded in fear build hatred, grievance, and cycles of violence. They build exploitation and destroy the sense that we share our societies and planet and must cooperate to find solutions for it. So it is the principles of human rights that build more stable, more peaceful, and more adaptable societies with dialogue, cooperation, and respect. They are a detailed guide through the unpredictable challenges of future events. Whether they involve transformation of the digital landscape or the prospect of violence, human rights principles and law have been constructed to protect humanity from danger. So, again, it is time to come together with dialogue and conviction to build greater respect for human rights. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan.
Wonderful.
No, thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Where should I sit?
Sit here.
Here? Here? Good. Here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. So, Your Majesties, Foreign Minister Wallström, Your Excellencies, now we come to the friendly conversation. Jan Eliasson doesn't need much introduction from me. One thing I thought I would say is that you, Jan, were the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, overlapping for a time at least, while the current High Commissioner was the head of UN Women. So this is a friendly conversation. This is not kind of tough interviewing or anything. Nonetheless, I wanted to begin by asking you, if it's okay with you, a more personal question. Because you've ranged wonderfully across, a whole set of problems. You've also ranged even more wonderfully across linked solutions to those. And I think you've given us a thread to understand how things that we often put in different, the trendy word is silos, but we often put them in different categories and we think about them separately. And you've got us thinking connectedly about climate, justice, conflict, human rights, gender equality, children's welfare, social protection. We see these things coming together. Can you tell us something about your experience, your development, personal formation or your professional formation, which you feel brings you into this sort of integrative approach to problems?
Well, I think when, the first thing that I want to say is that doctors, we usually see at health not only as the lack of disease. It's a much more comprehensive concept in terms of how you create all the social, economic, and political issues. Because there are social, economic, and determinants of health. So you are used to look at issues. Of course, if you're a specialist, you will be dealing with one particular problem. But I work a lot in public health and in pediatrics. You need to understand the environment and everything that goes on. On the other hand, everybody will tell me why a doctor is looking in defense issue. What's the relation on that? Well, medicine is a social science, and social sciences also have to deal with politics and with the relation between all actors to ensure democracy. And I was young, and I thought, incredible or not, but I was young once, and I thought, okay, our country, among other things, there are many reasons for the coup d'etat, but one of the reasons was the lack of relationship between the political dimension and the militaries. And there was sort of a complete distrust, not only after the coup d'etat, that could be natural, but before, and lack of conversation. And political world didn't understand about defense issues, usually. So at that time, I thought, you know what, I'm not an important person. And military think on power. That's the kind of issue, how they understand. So I'm never going to be somebody important, so I have to take the knowledge that will give me the power to be an interlocutor and counterpart to the militaries, because in the political arena, very few people knows about this. And we need to learn the lessons of Chile's history, not to repeat, the same mistakes. So that's why I started studying military issue. And in the military issue as well, you need to understand the whole context. It's the political, the economic, the cultural elements, and of course the strategic and defense issues. So I think for me it has been very natural to try always to see the relationship between things. It's linked to my family, it's linked to my life as a doctor, working in all these issues. And usually one of the things that for me is important is try to have the big picture, the comprehensive picture, and to understand all the factors that are included. And right now as well, when I see a country, if I go to visit a place, I try to understand the whole dimensions of what are the kinds of situations and factors that triggers conflict, what are the kinds of issues that are there. Because not only to see and talk about a list of violation of human rights, to try to understand what is there, what is provoking that kind of things, to try to identify what are the kind of initiatives that we can propose to change.
So what are the resources in the society itself to be addressing those abuses?
Of course. Yeah. And what else can we as an office support? Because sometimes you need national capacity building on institutions, on the rule of law, on the judiciary system. It's not that they don't want to violate human rights, but they don't have the capacity to respond adequately to that. So that's why I would say, and probably because as a doctor, you always, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't blame medicine and it's something more, but you need to understand the whole picture.
Yeah. So, I mean, Jan, I found when Michelle started by talking about these keystones, talking about dialogue and convictions and principles, that struck a huge chord for me when I think about some of the work we do at SIPRI. But it must have struck an enormous chord for you as well, thinking about, for example, the work you did with the SDGs in the formulation, the negotiation, the discussion of that, bringing all of these different people, states, governments, issues, etc. together.
Yeah, but even more, I was reminded of that period when we all saw the Latin American dictatorships. The map was full of dictatorships and horrible examples of political persecution, torture, death. And I remember working with several governments, but particularly with Olof Palme, and the solidarity that we felt with Chile at the time. Harald Edelstam is a name that is well known to you. And we saw also in Argentina and in Uruguay and Brazil horrible violations of human rights. And we tried on our side, knowing that we were thriving in a modern democracy, that you one day would make it. And for me, it's great to be at your side, Dr. Bachelet, that you brought your compassion to work in a very practical way, practical solidarity, helping children. But I also think that we should also be reminded, I think, from Michelle's speech and what you stand for, that without values, without keystones, without principles, we are lost. We go in zigzag back and forth. And I think it's good that we all think about identifying what you call the keystones. Hammarskjöld talked about the horizon, or the vision. But he also said, if you have a vision, then you also know what direction you should go. If you don't have the vision and the principles, you go back and forth, and decisions become so much easier if you have a good, strong set of values. And perhaps that, in some way, guided me when I was negotiating the SDGs, but I think it's a more basic thing that we should be reminded of.
Well, let me say just something. We did it, but it took us 17 years to recover democracy. It was a lot, but in all that way, Sweden was always by our side. Yeah. And I want to really thank that. And it's not a theoretical thing. I used to work in this NGO, and our program was financed by SIDA. So we really had a chance to provide medical care to a lot of young kids whose parents had been killed or missing or were tortured or in prison, and that they really need physical and mental health. And we, thanks to your support. Yeah. And now I have I'm a High Commissioner, and we're still receiving a lot of political and financial support from Sweden to be able to promote respect and protection for human rights. So
can I also say
that's very important.
I was struck from your speech how strongly you connected human rights both to the civil and political rights, but also the economic, social, and cultural. And I think for you as Commissioner for Human Rights, it's important to have the full global universal support for the human rights. And unfortunately, that is not the case. I am a little bit more pessimistic than you, it seems, on where we are on human rights. So maybe we'll land in the same territory. I think for you to be able to live up to the formula that you know so well, that in the world there is no peace without development, but there is no development without peace. And then we succeeded in 2005 to add that there is no peace, no development without respect of human rights. So you have three pillars on which a decent society is built, or decent international order is built. But how strong is that? are the pillars of peace, development, and in your case, the human rights. Because we have to fight, I think, very hard right now. I think human rights are under attack, very little knowledge about international humanitarian law, disregard of basic principles of international humanitarian law, and even democracies are getting out on a slippery slope.
Do you feel, Michel, that there is clearly arguments, disputes, conflicts going on about human rights. Do you feel that we're on a downward slope with that? Or is that to be too bleak and you remain strategically optimistic?
Well, I remain strategically optimistic because otherwise I should go home and be enjoying life.
So it's just you.
And I never give up. Huh? Yeah. But the thing is that if I wanted to put it very concretely, I think if tomorrow in the General Assembly the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had to be voted, it won't be approved as 70 years ago. I mean, that's how not optimistic I am. But I am optimistic strategically because I think at the end what I've been speaking about is true. We need those three pillars to work together. And when we try to solve conflicts, and many countries of the world are trying to influence conflicts, but they're not dealing with the root causes that are usually linked to human rights, we're not going to go anywhere. We're not going to stop migration. We're not going to stop climate change if we don't do the right things. And climate change, I mean, it's a reality that needs all of us to respond. It needs mitigation and adaptation actions, but it also means to think, what do we do with those people who are already being affected? This is not something for 20 or 30 years more. So even though I'm not optimistic, because there is a huge pushback. It's very difficult to include even the word human rights in any resolution. There is a huge pushback, but I truly believe that it depends from us to work and think how we can better explain and communicate, in every case, the importance of peace and security, development, and human rights, and how they are interlinked. Because on the other hand, no one wants conflict, and one of the things we're trying to work much more, and Jan was also fundamental in this when he did the Human Rights Upfront Initiative, but how we deal now with more prevention. And one of the things that we say, okay, let's improve our capacity of early warning signs. So we do have, in the UN human rights system, not only in my office, a lot of possibilities there, because you have the treaty bodies that they analyze this country situation, a lot of countries every year, where there's a lot of things that comes here. We have all the special rapporteurs, 80 special rapporteurs for 56 different areas, and they get a lot of information and they can identify. And we have our office in the places that we are not in all the world, but in many places, and we're always monitoring on different situations. And why I say this, that because we need to improve that, to identify where a conflict can happen. But at the same time, we need the international community to have early action. Because in the case of Myanmar, there were 5 reports that said that the genocide will come. How the Rohingyas were being treated, and well, there was no action at the end. So, and we saw what happened in 2017. And we know that when conflict are not preventing, there's a lot of bloodshed, there's a lot of cost, on all kinds of costs. So one of the things that I would like to is try to improve our capacities of identifying situations that can be prevented. We might not prevent it, because it doesn't also only depend on the work that we can do. But at least that's why when I've been in the Security Council once and in some other activities, insisting that we cannot separate human rights from peace and security, that there is a very important linkage. Of course, it's had in all ways as well, but there is a very important thing, and we identify in all very important conflict inequalities, violations of human rights that are there. And when you have countries like in Africa, where 70% of the population is under 30 or under 35, and they have 70% of unemployment, I mean, there is, there was no opportunities, no rights. So then comes this group like Boko Haram or others and propose them everything, gives them gun, money, and power. So we need to work on the root causes.
But Michel, don't you think it's a bit strange that this Universal Declaration of Human Rights is still met when you really ask about actions on the ground and with the governments. They still say this is a domestic issue for us, don't interfere. We know that these are universal rights, and that's why I think the responsibility to protect was such a great step forward, because we convinced the member states that they had a responsibility for their own population. They had to stop ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity was not allowed. Of course, in the end, the decisive body is the Security Council, but there was an attempt to say that solidarity with people in need under human rights violations should not stop at a border, but at those in need. And that's why we took this initiative of human rights up front. And I want to connect that also to what you said about prevention. Because the idea of bringing up the human rights violations was not only the principle of living up to human rights, but it was also a very effective, could be a very effective early warning mechanism. Yeah. Because when the human rights violations start, a kid can't go to the school because of his color or ethnic background or tribe, whatever. Father is tortured in the prisons. That's when you need to have action. Yeah. Instead of waiting for the civil war, which later then turns into proxy wars. Yes. As it's getting involved. Look at Syria, for instance. So I think we need to bring back the idea that human rights is important in itself, but also as an early warning mechanism. That way you can combine the political and the humanitarian aspect.
But Jan, there is a challenge there for us and for SIPRI. Right. And I should come clean a bit that we have a kind of agenda for this, to have a conversation in public about an issue which we have not concluded on. Because I think that, I mean, first of all, what would you say, emotionally, psychologically, or as a matter of principle, we're committed to the idea of human rights and a pretty broad range of human rights, not just political, not just civil, but social, cultural. And I thought that the way in which, Michel, you just straight out said climate change is an attack upon human rights, you know, it is. It's always going to be the poor who pay the biggest price when climate change happens, when environmental deterioration happens. So we have this range of challenges to think about. And then you say, you know, well, we say no peace without development, no development without peace, none of the above without human rights. Or we talk about human rights as an important part of the understanding how a conflict unfolds, what the early warning signs can be, the triggers for early action. But should we then be focusing on human rights?
Well, if you ask me, I think that's the direction we should go. For the time being, we look at the Sustainable Development Goals that you mentioned. We tried to bring in the human rights goals, human rights dimension in the goal number 16, which deals with peaceful societies, access to justice, and good institutions. But we didn't get that. So I think we could be very practical also, because one of the most important things, in my view, is also have good and strong institutions, free of corruption that you mentioned, and serving the people. If I look back at Sweden's progress, I think it's very much the fact that we set up good institutions, apart from the education and building infrastructure.
But what I think...
Sorry, can I then not riff, but ask a further question? If we should focus on human rights, and I wanted to ask you this, what would be your thoughts about how we should? What's the value added of an institution like SIPRI, which focuses on peace and security issues? What's our value added from the point of view of the human rights writ large?
Well, because there is this discussion if there is a relationship between peace and security and human rights, I think it would be very important if through your research on experiences you can show that direct relationship, how human rights development can be essential in preventing, and how there was so clear signs that if it would have been taken into account, we will have different perceptions and evolutions. The other thing that is important is that Jan was mentioning, and we listened to in the discussions of the Human Rights Council or other places, a lot of different issues against human rights. First of all, this is Western ideas. This is not universal ideas. But the truth is that when you look at the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the commissioners were from almost all over the world. I mean, at least there were 3 Latin Americans, 1 Chilean who played a very important role as well, a little commercial, but also we had a Chinese, Indian, and it was an Indian woman, because Eleanor Roosevelt, at that time, she was the chairperson of the commission, but at that time the concept was le droit de l'homme, the rights of the man, because it was they came from the French Revolution and included everyone. But there was this Indian feminist who said, no, if you say the right of men, women's rights are going to be affected. So that's why in the majority of this article speaks about human beings, and it says only because they're human beings. So I would say, I think they are universal. And the other thing some use is to say they violate human rights because they are confronting terrorism. We're saying, no, you can confront terrorism in compliance with humanitarian laws and human rights laws, and we can support and train your forces, your security forces, your armed forces to do both things, to fight terrorism. And the other thing, of course, is the excuse of terrorism. People who are not terrorists, and because they're critical of the government, they are accused of terrorism.
They just get labeled, yes.
But don't we all agree that security in today's world must be seen both from the perspective of hard security, former defense minister, but also the soft security, the broader definition? I think I'm very impressed by the staff of and the research work done in SIPRI on the relationship between climate change and security. And I personally have worked a lot with the water issues, both at the UN and also in the NGO, Water Aid, which I started here in Sweden. I mean, water is a scarce resource, shouldn't be in many cases, but it is. And what do you do when there's a scarce resource? You compete about it, you fight about it. When I was in Darfur, I saw the most horrible thing, how the militia threw a dead dog in the well in order to chase the people out of that Jebel Mara area to the camps. But what joy did they have of a village without water? In other words, we should try to look at the security implications of handling resources. That comes also to your issues of wealth. And I think to pursue that road is absolutely natural. We should be, as SIPRI has always been, the best when it comes to facts. And you told me as you defense minister, you read SIPRI's yearbook there. And we are known for that, and it's good. And I'm a Navy officer myself, but we also need to look at the security that is implied from, the situation on the ground, economically and socially, and I would say on human rights, which is also an early warning signal.
Well, Jan mentioned something that I just remind me that when I was Minister of Defense, of course, we also were looking at SIPRI's figures of the kind of weapons that we had. So we used to discuss, look, what important is the strategy, because what we have, it's already there. SIPRI has all the information. so that's something that was very interesting for us to also to know what's happening in the region and in the world at that time.
I mean, I think that the evidence is part of, or getting evidence is part of SIPRI's DNA. And sometimes we just get that evidence and it is for everybody who is interested. We're providing the infrastructure for an awful lot of research. And then there's our own research and our own analysis as well. And I think I agree. I mean, there's so much possibility to look closely into what the experience is. And I was very struck several times when you were talking about the way out of some of the problems. You said, and I have seen it done. And, the evidence is there for what works as well as for what goes wrong. There's one more issue I'd like to tease out before we finish. And I'm not quite sure that I can express it properly, which is why I want to rely on your two brains to get it out clearly. And that is the relationship, perhaps it's a relationship of attitude more than anything. Start by thinking that climate change is the challenge above all challenges, which says to humanity, look, you've got to cooperate. Right? You've got to, whatever divides you, the floor is shifting under your feet. You've got to cooperate. In order to be able to cooperate, we need things we've been talking about, the multilateral institutions, trust in each other, dialogue. How do we connect this thread together? Am I just being fanciful and looking for a connection too far to think that a society which is respecting human rights is probably a society which is able to develop the resilience which is needed, whether it's to resist the impact of climate change or to avoid experiencing the impact of climate change? Do you see what I mean? You know, human rights and resilience, climate change, economic challenges, and so on. Help me out here, because I'm floundering a bit, but I'm sure I'm half onto something.
Well, yeah, I think all of those things are very important. But if I may add something in my experience, and we have been in the spring sessions of the World Bank in a panel with Minister of Finance of the so-called B20, the most 20 vulnerable countries in terms of climate change. One of the things that I've been calling the financial institutions is that they need to estimate the cost of inaction. Because for many people who make political decisions, they will always cost what it means to do a thing. But when we calculate the cost of inaction, and some of the, like the weather, the meteorological or UN organization has calculated, I don't have the figures right now in my head. I mean, in the short term, it might be more to do things, but in the medium and longer term, the cost of inaction will be incredibly high, because I have been there and I know how people make decisions. I mean, I made a lot of decisions as a president because I truly believe that climate change is a reality. So we work strongly on oceans, marine protected areas, construction of national parks, etc., etc. But I was convinced. So I deal with the problems that when you have in a government between the Minister of Economy, of Fishery, and Environment, etc. But we need to convince people who make decisions. We need to convince, I mean, I'm talking about governments. Of course, it's essential to have societies, resilient society, very active society on one hand, but that can also be very resilient. But I believe that many times government can make better decisions if they really feel and understand what is the cost of not doing what needs to be done. And I've hopefully that the World Bank and the IMF are working on that, because I think it will help a lot.
There was a warning by the chairman of the Bank of England, just saying to banks, you're going to go out of business if you don't address this. Sorry, Jan.
I just think it's about time for us to start to make less of a distinction between national and international.
Right.
If you look at the huge issues today in the world and in Europe, is climate and migration. What is international? And what is national? It's the same thing.
It's the same.
So we need to see that we have to do things at home in order to create conditions for good international cooperation. And that's why it's such a tragic situation now with this leaving multilateral institutions. I say it openly, quite disappointed in US, which was very much part of Human Rights Council, leaving the council, and sending the message that they're not taking part in the migration compact, sending the message that they're not part of the climate agreement, and by that sending the message that the outside world is a problem. Merchandise from there, people, ideas, and then you turn inward in a world which needs what you said, cooperation, and not only among governments. I think it's absolutely crucial that we go across the board, parliaments, civil society, private sector, academia, and I think we have then tools in our hand. I don't want to bring out the charter, which I have in my pocket, but we have the global goals.
Yeah.
It's the survival kit for humanity.
Yes. Yes.
And that gives me hope. But I think I myself, who had such hope for the world, wherever after the Second World War, when the nightmare of the 30s was behind us, Richard Solomon from Chicago set up the Holocaust Museum. You know what I mean? The Stalinism and the Holocaust and 50 million dead. After that came a whole revival of a hopeful future. UN, Universal Declaration, 1951 Refugee Convention, Geneva Protocols, and off we went. And then something went wrong, even with the end of the Cold War. We got to pick up and be more muscular and forceful, standing up for those, what's called liberal democracy or whatever. But anyway, the kind of humanistic version, because now, what you said in the speech, the fear factor is used as a tool to divide us. And the unfortunate thing is that it pays off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It gives.
Yeah. So, you both have related to powerful people. You've both talked with, you've met them, individuals. This is a question which I didn't warn you about beforehand.
Oh, you didn't.
You did not.
I did not.
So it's over now.
I often do things that I don't warn him about. He'll get used to it in time.
No.
If you were sitting down with someone now, you've got the opportunity, we've just been saying, persuading governments about this. Keystones. You gave us keystones at the beginning. They're general keystones. They're the keystone of dialogue. It's the keystone of being true to your core principles and your convictions. But in the sense of a keystone issue, what kind of message would you be trying to give now to a powerful individual or entity of your choice? Insurance company? An American president? A Chinese president? Whoever it might be. Sort of little active imagination. Who would you talk to, and what would be the thing that you would say about the issues that we've been talking about now?
Michelle, you first.
No, you first. You have bigger freedom, Jan.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
No, but yeah. Well, I don't know who I would talk to. I have to think about it.
Right.
But one thing that I have learned, that you can never convince somebody that's powerful saying that that's the right thing to do.
Right.
You have to say that's the right thing to do and why is the right thing to do, but you also need to include why is the smart thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of things I'm always thinking on. Which are the kind of argument that can convince that particular person or the business and human rights or the tech companies or whatever I have a relationship that it's the right thing to do, but it's a smart thing to do. And it will be positive, it will be beneficial, it will be rentable. When I'm talking rentability, it doesn't mean necessarily economic rentability. It can be social, political rentability, economic rentability for the country and so on. Because I think, in particular those who have to make hard political decisions, you have to find a way of communicating why is the smart thing to do, because otherwise, only based on right things to do, it won't work. That's my experience. And I'm in the office, we're trying to think on how, based on the same principles and values, we can also think on a narrative that can be appealing for other people, that only talking about human rights in abstract won't convince them.
There are a lot of arguments that suggest that advances in rights and in, for example, equality before the law came about because the social and the economic elites, as they changed, began to believe that this change was in their interest, both right and in their interest.
Well, since I had more time to think than you, I thought of course, you could look at leading figures like Pope Francis, and I would even masochistically enjoy a meeting with President Trump and President Xi, although I'm not sure that I will communicate effectively. We can also think about people who now try to move in another direction. Macron tries in France, relatively successful, but I think also to pick up the energy in youth. If I look at my hope factors, there are many threats, many problems, but the hope factors to me are women, first time in history where I think they will be fully empowered, coming next few decades, definitely, all over the world. Secondly, young people. And we should not only work for young people, and we have a great responsibility to give them better conditions, even in Sweden, of how they will grow up, but also in the world. And also to learn to work with young people, engage them. I go to my grandchildren's schools. I feel younger every visit. It's just fantastic. And they have a sense of honesty and what is right and wrong. Climate, peace, war. And then I believe in knowledge. This thing that we have in our pocket, yes, it's a blessing in a way, but it's also a bit of a curse. But we need to take advantage of the enormous potential of knowledge, but then also make a very important distinction between facts and alternative facts, and lies and truth, because we are gliding on this right now. And not the last hope, the fourth hope is international cooperation in our own interest, not only for UN and its blue color, but it's just in our own interest.
One of the good things to talk when we are thinking on this new sort of third generation human rights is that sometimes in democracies for a long time, young people don't feel that they're a risk because they take for granted democracy. But for example, for them, it's much more appealing to work on climate change and human rights, or in technology and human rights, something that is linked to their personal initiatives. So that's why I'm also trying to work with young people, but on areas that could really call them to be part of, and to try to be more active in the human rights movement everywhere.
I think that we could carry on talking just for hours, but I don't know if we're allowed to hold the people here while we do that. So let's interrupt our conversation for the moment. I hope that the three of us get a chance to continue talking later on in the evening, and we'll move on with the program. And so can I invite you to thank Michelle Bachelet and Jan Eliasson for their...
Thank you, Dan. So we go that way because...
And so now I would like to invite Margot Wallström, Foreign Minister of Sweden, to the stage for concluding remarks, after which then we'll hear from Staffan Scheja again. Margot, please, welcome to the stage.
Your Majesties, Madam High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's, of course, a big honor and a pleasure for me to conclude this 2019 SIPRI Lecture, and also to have the honor to thank you, Michelle Bachelet. And it was as if you had seen my notes when you answered here on the stage. Because you know what happens when we listen to you? We start by thinking, what she says makes sense. And then we continue to think, this is a smart woman. And actually, she seems to know what she's talking about. And thirdly, we decide, we believe her. I believe her. And we end by thinking she can also do it. We believe that you can do it with everything that you've explained to us, your ideas and values, you can do it. But I think you will need a little help from your friends, because this is also kind of mission impossible these days. So you can trust us, Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner, that we will continue to support you in your endeavor to fight for human rights and in this important post that you are holding. So you are among friends, and I want to thank you, and I think we should give her another round of applause. So thank you for addressing us. I will try to sum up this evening into 3 brief calls to action about peace and security, and how can we not, in this building, speak about music. So I would like to connect this to the beautiful Chopin Nocturne we heard in the beginning, so skillfully performed by Staffan Scheja. Thank you for that. So the first one is about music and peace. Because music conveys emotions and a kind of meaning that go beyond what can be expressed in words. It's a language that does not care much about national borders, ethnicity, or religion. And there is an enormous strength in this universality. I think we underestimate the role of music, and I would say culture as well, in bringing people together and in helping people understand, forgive, and reconciliate with each other. Also, music and culture offer a possibility for us to make contact and to build trust with actors that otherwise might not be hostile to us that otherwise might be hostile to us for whatever reason. So my first call is this: let us not forget, let us get better at promoting the role of music and culture in peace building and conflict prevention. Secondly, during 9 years, Frédéric Chopin had a relation with Amandine Dupin, or George Sand, who during her whole life fought for the rights of women to shape their lives and contribute to society. And you know that I do take every opportunity to repeat this, to stress the strong priority that we place on gender equality in our foreign policy. So my second call is this: let us join forces in making sure that women and men enjoy the same rights, representation, and resources, and there will be more peace. I keep coming back to this because evidence is there, and still the need for more women in peace talks, in international politics is urgent. Madame Bachelet is a true role model in this field. And thirdly and finally, I want to say something about cooperation. Because I recently learned that Chopin's music was forbidden in Poland during the Second World War, but was played in meetings of the resistance movement. And I'll be going to Warsaw the day after tomorrow. And one of the things we will talk about, maybe not so much Chopin's music, I think, but how we cooperate to tackle modern security threats together. Because the big threats to our security, be they climate change, nuclear weapons, or terrorism, know no borders. And as neighbors, our countries are dependent on each other in tackling these threats effectively. However obvious that might sound, the logic that seems to be governing international relations today is the opposite, that of relations between countries as a zero-sum game. And sadly, once one actor starts behaving selfishly, it creates a downward spiral. Maybe what I just said about the Second World War is a reminder of what that spiral might lead to. So my third and final call is this: let us join forces in promoting the logic of common security in international relations, where we work through dialogue and cooperation for the common goal of peace and prosperity for all. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for letting me finish this wonderful evening. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please rise and remain by your seats while their Majesties, the King and Queen of Sweden, exit the hall.